This is the Evergreen Empire.
Green grow the forests and fair flow the streams. The gentle deer grazes, the wild blossom gleams. From ocean wave raging to mountain serene, all nature's proclaiming our land's evergreen.
Welcome to Columbia Conversations. I'm Feliks Banel, editor of Columbia Magazine for the Washington State Historical Society. On this episode, Ron Judd, staff writer for the Seattle Times Pacific Northwest magazine, on what we can learn from the history of Seattle and the Northwest during the roaring 1920s that might come in handy in the 2020s.
People talk about the American experiment as if it's some petri dish kind of thing. But the more I study history, the more I think that term is so accurate, because we've been really close at times to having this whole thing just kind of fall apart.
Ron's piece in the Seattle Times Pacific Northwest magazine is called "Studying Seattle's Roaring Twenties History Might Help Us Get Through This Next Decade." It appeared in the print edition of the Sunday Times of January 12, 2020, and is also available at seattletimes.com. I spoke with Ron Judd by phone from a snowy Whatcom County. So Ron Judd, thanks for joining us on Columbia Conversations. I love the piece you have in the Seattle Times about looking at the 1920s and thinking about the 2020s. Where did you get the idea from?
I just sort of, I'm not one of these people who likes to write about decades and periods, signifying like people talk about the Roaring Twenties. Everything has a title, and I think it's all a little bit too tidy. But in talking to my editor at the Times, who I've worked with for a long time, we were talking about the dawn of a new decade, and I think the 1920s is in particular is a really interesting decade in the Northwest, especially, and it sort of lines up with my area of historical research about some radical politics back in that time. So I took on this sort of daunting and always sometimes questionable task of trying to write a straight history piece for a modern journalism outlet, which is always tricky because some people will just gloss over with boredom. But I tried to talk about that era and what made it unique, and bring it into the present context of politics and our own modern history today.
I think it's great, and I think people love local history. I think that's, whether it's on a newspaper website or, like a radio station website, whatever, it feels like local history, especially with social media, gets a lot of traction these days. People like to see old pictures, and they sometimes even have the patience to read read the captions for the old pictures too.
This piece actually got a really good response in that way. I mean, and I think it's especially important that we try to put out this local history because we have so many newcomers here who don't know it, and a lot of us who've grown up around here, like you and me, probably know pieces of it, but a lot of our, especially Seattle residents, are so new that it's all new to them, and I think they find it really interesting.
So take me through the 1920s, kind of maybe three or four things, step by step, like the 1920s person or history thing, and how it compares to something in the 2020s.
Yeah, I thought the thing that marked the 1920s was especially the way the decade started, the early 1920s, and this is true around the country, but especially in the Northwest. There was so much of what motivated people to act and promote their causes in the 1920s were a reaction against what happened in the 19-teens. And, it doesn't take a genius to see some sort of parallels between that and a lot of our politics today, which are a strong reaction to nationally to the last administration. We have an administration now that's trying to erase that administration. And you saw a lot of that in the early 1920s with people responding to the leftist progressive politics, especially in the Northwest. And that's something that's been really studied heavily by historians, the Seattle strike of 1919 and all of the progressive unionism that happened here. And we're known for that. But I found in my own historical research that one thing that hasn't been as explored as deeply and probably as much as it should be is the way that leftist progressive reputation in the Northwest prompted an opposite and equal reaction of really stout sort of right-wing conservatism that grew up in response to that. And after World War I, you saw a lot of the progressives and the progressive movement and people in the Northwest who were part of the labor movement, or even things as sort of ordinary as the Protestant church system, who were sort of leftist, progressive, not quite socialist, but very sort of collectivist, at that time. And there was a strong retribution against all these people. People lost their jobs, lost their lives. People were imprisoned under the Alien Sedition Act. Very ugly time as far as people responding to what had just gone on. And that struck me as very similar to the way that we behave today. And I tried to touch on that and make the point really generally that these kind of strains and these arguments that are alive in our politics today are not new. The people that are, out calling Democratic candidates today socialists aren't inventing that process. They're just, in fact, they're 100 years behind the wave, and you think they come up with something new. But this has been part of our history and part of our sort of cultural bloodstream in the country for a long time, and it's come up and been beaten down, and it's come up again. And I think it's especially acute in the Northwest, where it seems to be a little bit more raw, the politics on both sides here for whatever reason than elsewhere in the country. And that's what I found interesting about the comparison between the 2 decades, at least the way they're starting.
And so, I mean, and I've always been fascinated with that notion of it's almost like kind of anything goes out here as long as it doesn't hurt anybody. You're kind of allowed to sort of explore whatever extremist views you have, and especially going back to the turn of the last century. And so, in the terms of the chicken and egg part of it, did the progressivism come first, and then the right-wing stuff was a reaction to it, or were they sort of both always there, or any sense about kind of which came first?
That's a really good question, and I've played around with that a lot, and kind of come to the piece with the question that it doesn't really matter. I mean, they're both here. I think in a sort of, if you take the 10,000-foot view and look back at history in the Northwest, especially, you can say that the progressivism probably came first. I mean, there was the people who settled the Euro settlers who settled this region were a mix of beliefs and cultures and kind of the proverbial melting pot. But just the nature of how we all started to make a living here through resource extraction and things sort of tended to cause people who are common laborers to be exploited, and that brought on the strong union movement. And progressivism here, there was always a spirit of progressive adventure here among people who were willing to try things out. That's why the Wobblies had such a strong foothold here. They were going to make the world's one big union, and if there was a place to do it, it was here, right?
Yeah.
People could reinvent themselves and start fresh, and it was kind of a clean slate. So yeah, I think progressivism here owes its roots to that spirit, which is still here to some degree, I think. But people tend to overlook the strong retribution to that happened, especially after World War I, which is why I still think that our country kind of reels from shock waves that were set off by World War I. Even 100 years later, we're still sort of rebounding from ripples that were set off by that conflict.
Yeah, which I guess is the first time the United States really wades into a big overseas conflict. I mean, there'd been the Spanish-American War, but in terms of wading into Europe and like the sort of the deep sort of heart of the world civilization at that point, World War I is when the America that we still know today, that's when it really begins, I guess.
Yeah, and I think it made, just from my limited studies of the era, and there's people that know way more about this than I do, but the message I take away from the post-World War I era is that Americans felt vulnerable. After World War I, it was sort of like, oh my God, we're not immune from this stuff that's happening overseas that we've been reading about, in the New York Times, and the violent revolution and the horrors of mechanized war that people came to grips with, and people were scared. And since then, I think that our politics in the country have been marked by what I call the politics of fear, which is that people are afraid that what we have here and what little things that we cling to here that we enjoy as our lifestyle are in danger. And I think you've seen that kind of revived in the country after 9/11 in a very sort of similar way, where we kind of got over that and got complacent and got to work on some domestic things that were aspirational rather than reactive. And then 9/11 comes along, and all of a sudden people are feeling again vulnerable in the politics of fear that we saw happen here, especially in the Northwest 100 years ago, sort of just recycled almost in the same sort of pattern. And so I think it's important to look at what happened back then and see how we responded.
And I mean, one of the figures who pops out in your piece, and who I've read about before in terms of the 1919 general strike, and then going on down to found San Clemente down in California, kind of completely changing industries, is Ole Hansen.
Yeah, Ole Hansen the mayor of Seattle who sort of bumbled his way through the general strike, and the general strike collapsed on its own accord after less than a week, and nobody got hurt, and Ole Hansen then tried to turn the thing into his own personal sort of political birth nationally, and went on this national speaking tour and talked about basically how I alone stopped the collectivist revolution from launching from the shores of Puget Sound, and he tried to make himself this strongman figure, and he was representative of a lot of the establishment thought in Seattle at the time, including the newspaper publishers and people who were in positions of authority. Wanted to make a lesson of these people that had dared to go on strike and try to shut down a city. And that was a political movement that was happening around the country, and this was at the start of what people now talk about as the first Red Scare. And Seattle and its conservative icons had a big role in getting that rolling, and Hansen was one of those people. Ultimately failed, but...
Yeah, and what's amazing also about that era is that in so many ways, the modern city that's in place now, both infrastructure-wise and just the look and feel and just the sort of urban core of Seattle is pretty much all kind of built in the 1920s. The streets are laid out that way. The Smith Tower's there, of course, and you have this like there's great photos in your piece in the Times of the Civic Center with the Civic Auditorium that's now McCaw Hall. And
right.
all these pieces that they're still there. It's almost like, Seattle's not nearly as old as a city like Paris or London, but it feels like we've built the city we're going to have for at least the next couple hundred years, and it seems like that city was mostly built in the 1920s.
Yes, I agree, and a lot of the civic framework and just the actual literally carving out of the city out of the what used to be a bunch of hills alongside Lake Union with the Denny Regrade project. And I also thought that was an interesting parallel in that the city itself was kind of, back in 1920, was just at the end of this huge physical transformation in addition to all the cultural and political stuff, because they had literally carved out mountainsides of earth in what's now the Denny Regrade. It's not called that anymore except to old timers like ourselves. But, and we've seen that happen again just in this start of the 20s with the South Lake Union transformation, and somebody goes downtown who has been there 5 years and goes, oh my God, what happened here, right? And it's such a shocking thing where people are sort of like, this is a different place. It feels different. It has a completely different feel. And I think that the 1920s, you're right, as a lot of our infrastructure that we enjoy or lament today definitely came together then.
I was chatting with somebody recently who said that when I see people complaining or fretting that all these things that they love about Seattle are going away, it's usually that person hasn't lived here very long. They lived here maybe 10, 15, 20 years, where people like this person I was talking to, myself, who've been here our whole lives, we've seen Seattle changing constantly. If you've been paying attention, Seattle's constantly been reinventing itself and tearing things down and ripping up entire neighborhoods and putting in freeways with a viaduct or whatever. And there's sort of this sense I found among longtime residents that, we've sort of seen this all before, and that Seattle's strength is this ability to reinvent and to become almost a completely different city culturally and economically anyway, every generation or so.
Yeah, I think that's true, and I think history shows that. I mean, the thing that I think that has always made Seattle kind of special is that resiliency, and part of that I think is not on purpose. It's just a response to the fact that we've had these economic cycles, boom-bust cycles that have been really profound, even more so than a lot of other places, with industries that just go kaput and then they come back or another one takes their place. And it's, we have to change to exist, And I think, though, that some of that is, like you say, intentional, and it kind of reflects that sort of pioneer spirit, at least of the Euro people who live here. Who have always seen the place as a place to start new, and that's still the case today. I mean, when Jeff Bezos was looking for a place to plant his flag and make his empire, he saw Seattle. Of course, the lack of an income tax didn't hurt, but that it was known for that kind of can-do spirit, and let's try something new here, and that's, I think, what's attracted a lot of the tech world to Seattle today. But you're right. I mean, if you're here and you spend a lot of time here and you don't see the rapid nature of the change so much, or there's periods where we'll go by for 20 years and not a lot changes, and then all of a sudden it kicks into gear again. And so some of the people do see it as profound change. But you're right, that's been wrapped into our history, I think, ever since the beginning.
Hey, so back in the 1920s, was our baseball team any better?
Probably. It would have to be. Right?
It seems like we're stuck in that kind of painful adolescent era where the team's been bad only for, 20 years or so, not long enough to be beloved like the Cubs, or not short enough where it's just a temporary thing. We're sort of in between where it's going to be sort of a cliche thing, and we have to live with it until it either gets better or gets a lot worse than we're used to.
We're well on our way to historic ineptitude in terms of baseball. I mean, I think that you can argue that our baseball franchise is by far the least successful of any professional sports franchise in the last 30 years.
Yeah. Is it the only team that hasn't been in the World Series ever?
I think now, yeah. That's quite the honor, quite the distinction.
Although I do count the Milwaukee Brewers, and they were in the World Series, and they were the Seattle Pilots originally. So technically, I feel like we have had a Seattle Major League team that has eventually made it to the World Series, just like in the witness protection program, though.
Yeah, sort of.
Now, in the 1920s, so studying 1920s, what tips do you have for people listening for how to better prepare for the 2020s? Is there anything we can do or anything you can predict about the coming decade?
Well, I think, and I pointed this out in my story, that, you can look at what happened here in the 1920s and get really bummed out about it in one sense, on the one hand, because you feel like, oh my God, we're a lather, rinse, repeat society. We keep repeating these mistakes because we don't appreciate our own history. But I also take some inspiration in seeing sort of how messed up we've been at times in the past. And I made a reference in my story to this term, which I used to not like as a historian or as a journalist. When people talk about the American experiment as if it's some petri dish kind of thing. But the more I study history, the more I think that term is so accurate, because we've been really close at times to having this whole thing just kind of fall apart. And I think the 20s and the 30s were one of those times, right? And we've had some profound challenges to our political system over that 100 years that have been scarier than I think where we are right now in a lot of ways, and we've still managed to muddle through. So I take some comfort in some of this history and knowing that we can overcome these divisions. But the other lesson that I learned, and I think this is very important for people, is to look at the long view, which is that the stuff that's happening in politics today, which freaks a lot of us out and depresses a lot of us, has been an undercurrent in our politics for 100 years. And, I said this in the story that you can't get to a place in America or in the Northwest and say, we've carved out the society we want, let's live in it and enjoy it. I mean, you can try that, but it doesn't work, because these forces that want to knock that down are always there. They've always been there. And you can't say that those forces have been defeated as much as beaten back a ways. And so what I hope people will take from the history is that fight goes on, which is depressing in one way, but it's winnable. So it's encouraging in another way. And I really feel like we need to look at that history to get a sense of that, of how serious the challenges to our way of life are now, and the fact that we've been to some of these places before, which is both good and bad, I guess.
Very nice. Yeah, excellent use. I love history that's sort of muscular and practical, and that you can take it and put it to work like a hammer or a saw or something. So I wholeheartedly endorse your approach. So, hey, Ron Judd, thank you for joining us on Columbia Conversations.
Great to be here. Thanks.
Thank you to Ron Judd for speaking with me for this episode of Columbia Conversations from the Washington State Historical Society. Ron's piece in the Seattle Times Pacific Northwest magazine is available at seattletimes.com. For more information about Columbia Magazine or to subscribe, please visit washingtonhistory.org. I'm Feliks Banel.